Hello and welcome to PSA's Let's Squawk About It. I'm Sam Schaefer, and today our guest is a professor of poultry science at Middle Tennessee State University. Join me in welcoming Kevin Downs. Kevin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise?
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate the invitation to visit with you a little bit today. I am a professor of poultry science at MTSU. I've been at MTSU now for 21 years, so I've been here a while. Primarily teach. We have a poultry science program here. We offer a poultry science minor for our students. We also are pretty active in some extracurricular activities. We have a poultry science club that's very active. We have a poultry judging team that is becoming more and more active. And we also, which is what we're going to visit with a little bit today, is we have a fairly active, mostly undergraduate research program, which I'm proud of the good students that we've been involved here. So most of what I do is teaching, but able to do a little research as well on the side and engage some students also.
And today we're talking about actually a research project that you conducted with one of your students. And that was all about the color that birds see, and specifically, of course, broilers. Am I correct?
Right. We and I always give him credit because this was actually his idea. Joseph Gulizia, he's currently a graduate student at Auburn in poultry science, working on his master's, and he'll finish that up this coming semester. He should finish up his master's, and he'll start his PhD there in poultry science as well. So I always give him credit because he did come up with this idea. It's kind of a funny story. We were actually, I don't even remember, we were driving somewhere and just talking, and he just came up with the idea. And I'm like, that's kind of interesting. I never thought about that. And so it just went from there. So what we did, and we don't have huge facilities to do research, but we were able to conduct a couple of studies. They were published in a referee journal article looking at different colors of feed. We did one research study that looked at coloring feeds red, green, and blue, and then we followed that up with coloring feeds purple, yellow, and orange. And so it was kind of interesting. It was his idea. I always do give him credit, and he's the one that ran the studies and analyzed all the data. So he did all the heavy lifting on the studies.
So before we get into discussing the research project that you guys took on, why don't we talk a little bit about poultry? And we know that poultry can see in color, but
Right.
What is the difference from how humans see in color based on what we know?
And I'll be the first to admit I'm no expert on eye physiology of the bird. I have learned a lot through this process as well. We do know that, we think of the visual spectrum that humans or mammals see, certainly humans being that we can see in color. And we typically see in that red, green, blue range. It's what we usually think of. The one thing that sets the vision of the bird, and we'll lump the chicken in there as well, is their ability to see a little bit beyond the normal visual range that we as humans can see. So when we talk about getting on the edge of that visual range where those wavelengths get much shorter, the violets, and then into the ultraviolet, the birds actually have the ability to see in that range where we can't actually.
It's an interesting topic. Before I came across this this paper and the research that you guys are doing, I was under the impression that poultry were colorblind, which I now know is very wrong, which is wrong to assume. But I mean, I think this research that you guys did was interesting, and what your research did was you looked at coloring different types of poultry feed and seeing which feed that the birds gravitated to and if that changed their feed consumption. So with the research that you and your student did, what colors did you notice that birds tended to gravitate to, or were there colors that they didn't gravitate to?
It was interesting, and the caveat too is that this is a fairly small study. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it was somewhere in the range of 250 birds for each study, so it wasn't a huge study. And the first study, like I mentioned before, we looked at red, green, and blue. The second study, we looked at purple, yellow, and orange. And we did not, our objective going into this was not necessarily focused solely on eye physiology and what the birds see, or even any preferences. Really, we were looking at changing the color of feed potentially change feed consumption if we could theoretically color a feed and it would cause the birds to consume more because they were somehow stimulated by that feed color, then we could potentially, the birds could consume more feed and then potentially perform better. And we didn't see a whole lot of effects, admittedly. We are going to, me and some other students this fall, we're going to kind of follow up this study a little bit and do some more behavioral preferential stuff. But what we did see in the studies that were done previously is we did see that there were some effects, and I won't say preferences per se at this point because we really didn't evaluate that, but we did see some mild effects of that blue purple type feed or colored feed that is on the edge of that visual spectrum that, you know, we can't see as well as the birds can. We did see some effect on performance there a little bit, not a lot, but we did see a little bit. And so that did intrigue us as far as some follow-up studies looking at specifically blue and purple. So those were the two colors that really stood out. Now, there were some indications as well, kind of converse of that, there were colors that did not actually, the birds appeared not to perform or not to prefer as well. And that was red, actually. Interestingly, we saw in the first study that the birds performed fairly poor, relatively speaking, obviously. Birds performed fairly poor on red and didn't prefer that, or at least, again, we didn't duplicate preferences, but it did appear that that treatment they didn't prefer, if you want to use that term.
Did you notice, like, when they gravitated towards this blue and purple, were they eating more, or was it just they seemed to just go towards that food specifically?
Yeah, not really. We didn't see, and you know, I don't want to overstate it. We did see some minor effects on performance. With purple, there were some effects on feed conversion. With the blue, there were some effects on body weight gain. Interestingly, and I'm still, you know, still trying to kind of figure out exactly why there weren't a lot of effects on feed consumption itself. Even though we saw a performance effect, mild, there weren't we didn't see a lot of effects on feed consumption because, again, they didn't have a choice. You know, if you had birds on the red treatment, those birds only had red feed.
Right.
If you have birds on, so they didn't necessarily, it's hard to say they gravitated to one or the other, but again, when some of our follow-up studies we're planning, we're going to start looking at some more preferential things and some behavioral things, comparing two feeds within one pen. So it'll be kind of an interesting follow-up.
Well, it sounds like it's definitely paved the way for some further research and it sparked some interest. I mean, it sounds like it really could go somewhere by looking into it a little bit further.
Yeah, and it did surprise me and Joe both. You know, admittedly, there has been previous research done with feed color in poultry, and but most of that was either not in broilers, or the research that was done with broilers tended to be fairly old research. So that was another one of our objectives, was to look at, you know, what do we see in kind of our today's broiler. So, you know, yeah, I'm kind of excited about what we're going to do this fall and see what we find as far as when we can give the birds some actual preference or some ability to choose. And we're going to hopefully be able to do some camera work, some visual stuff where we can observe the feeding behaviors and that kind of stuff. So I'm excited about that.
It sounds good. And just like we kind of established before we started the segment here, this semester starting, so it's exciting to kind of get back in the swing of things, get back in the lab and do some of this research.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for joining me today to discuss this topic. It sounds like you mentioned, there's more research planned, and definitely maybe we could do a follow-up later on in the future.
Absolutely, love to. I appreciate the invitation, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you have a good day.
You too.